Okay, so welcome to Secret Histories and Spiritual Revolutions, week one. And very excited to have you here and to dive into these topics. I thought I would start with a little bit about my background, which I assume that many of you know already. I'm the author of a number of books. My first book was Breaking Open the Head, that came out in 2002. Then in 2006, I released 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. 2016, I suppose, How Soon Is Now came out. And around 2020, I brought out When Plants Dream, Ayahuasca, that was co-written with Sophia Rocklin, an anthropologist. And basically, my first book, Breaking Up with That, came out before the current psychedelic renaissance was in full gear. And in fact, at that point, you really couldn't talk about psychedelics in sort of polite conversation, polite company in New York or in the media world. People kind of laugh at you. The psychedelics were still very taboo and repressed and ridiculed. And I thought I sort of had got into a spiritual kind of crisis. I remembered my psychedelic experiences from when I was in college and younger, and I decided to go dive back in and explore them again, and then started learning about iboga and ayahuasca and so on. And so I ended up going to different indigenous cultures around the world, going through their initiations with them. And along the way, I had a number of sort of psychic, paranormal, supernatural experiences that were extremely challenging for me because I come from a sort of skeptic, secular materialist background. And it was impossible for me to hold on to that, paradigm. So I suddenly had to begin to really think about different ways of understanding the nature of reality, understanding the world. And I found that what these shamanic cultures expressed with their ideas of these different levels of spiritual reality and animism and interconnectedness and so on seemed more truthful to me, had to be more truthful than the flat out, materialist worldview. And that kind of led me to the second book, 2012, which I've just republished as Quetzalcoatl Returns, where I was looking seriously at the prophecies of indigenous cultures like the Hopi and the Maya, the Aztecs, and so on, as well as looking at the apocalypse tradition in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and the Yuga cycles from Hinduism and so on. And that book was very philosophical, and I basically shifted fully to this perspective of monistic or analytic idealism. I thought that we'll talk about a lot during this course, but essentially the idea is that it sort of flips. The materialist idea is that the physical universe, the physical world is quote unquote real. Consciousness is an epiphenomenon of physical evolution and kind of an accidental byproduct of evolution. The idealist idea is that consciousness, which is actually the primary ground of all experience, is also the primary ground of the universe. And everything that happens within consciousness. The material reality is a projection, or in some ways an extension of consciousness. And we are all in a way projections or temporarily dissociated aspects of that underlying field of consciousness, which is learning about itself through us. And in that book, I also looked at the Mayan ideas around kind of a change in the world ages in 2012, at the beginning of another 5,125-year cycle. And I still think that seems to be quite accurate when we look at what's happening ecologically, geopolitically, and technologically, as well as what's happening in terms of sort of the evolution of consciousness, the rediscovery of the world's esoteric traditions. So I feel all of those are pointing towards a new model or a new paradigm, or in some sense a new world. The Hopi talked about the shift from the fourth world to the fifth world. So that still is always the background of my thinking, the shamanic and the sort of prophetic possibilities. Yeah, I think those are the two books that we'll cover for now. We can always talk about other stuff later. Also, just to mention that I think I have a alchemist ancestor, Christopher Pinchbeck, 1670, 1732, who created an alloy of tin called Pinchbeck gold. He was also a maker of extremely complex clocks for the royal family, and they often have like astrological conferences and so on. And then the word Pinchbeck came to mean anything false or spurious, counterfeit or a fake. I don't know, so you could talk about a Pinchbeck age of literature, or a Pinchbeck age of culture, something like that. So yeah, that's always kind of like covered in my field, that I had this ancestor who, must have been trying to attain, achieve the philosopher's stone, turn base metals into gold, but he ended up with Pinchbeck. One of the questions that I find very fascinating that I want to think about and reflect on and try to address with this course is this notion of a Prisca Theologia, the idea that there's a kind of underlying truth, a single truth theology that exists in all religions, that it was given by the all or the one or God to man in distant antiquity, and we're meant to kind of recover and restore that tradition. Antoine Favre, who I'm probably going to massacre a lot of pronunciations. That's just the way it is. He's a French writer on occultism and academic, and he notes the existence of a primordial tradition is posited, of which the various traditions and religions spread throughout the world would be only fragmented and more or less authentic pieces. Here, esotericism is the teaching of the ways that would permit attaining knowledge of this tradition or contributing to restore it. So you have definitely a sort of dichotomy in scholarship around these topics, whereas people who are part of the traditional academies completely disbelieve that there is such a thing as a Prisca Theologia or some united truth that isn't just a human-made construct. So this question of, is there some form of unbroken Hermetic tradition that can be recaptured, rediscovered, made use of again, in a sense? This was from the floor of the Siena Cathedral. This is Hermes Trismegistus, who was very popular in the Renaissance. So Wouter Hanegraaff, one of the kind of most important contemporary occult academic scholars, in his book on the Hermetic Tradition, A Guide for the Perplexed, talks about how Western esotericism is the Academy's dustbin of rejected knowledge. And I think it's really the case that occultism, esotericism really became like the repressed other of modernity, from the Enlightenment until today. Western esotericism is a modern scholarly construct, not an autonomous tradition that already existed out there and merely needed to be discovered by historians. And this guy, Paul Kleber-Monod, also very interesting contemporary academic scholar, reinforces this sort of negative idea around there being like a true philosophy, underlying. The agelessness of the occult turns out to be an illusion, or in many cases, a mystification. Because its adherents have made such efforts to disguise its recent origins, it seems doubtful that much of the commercialized occultism of today can be traced back beyond the late 19th century. Yeah, I mean, I have I guess in a way, an advantage over these people in that I had, which I sort of wrote about recently in the newsletter, some very profound kind of occult experiences that through, psychedelics, where I was with a friend, we both had to share this experience of these beings kind of surrounding us, that really did feel like something from the sort of Crowley universe, and a number of experiences which just made me take this idea of these sort of realms of diamonds or astral beings as a much more serious thing. So, but then you have somebody like Martin Booth, who wrote this wonderful book, Secret History of the World, which he claims is a kind of recapitulation of the ancient knowledge from the mystery schools. And he argues that an ancient and secret philosophy that originated in the mystery schools was preserved and nurtured down the ages through the medium of secret societies, including the Knights Templar and the Rosicrucians. Sometimes this philosophy has been hidden from the public, and at other times it has been placed in plain view, though always in such a way as to remain unrecognized by outsiders. A lot of Booth's book is informed by, I would say, Rudolf Steiner as his core source for his view of like these sort of previous incarnational worlds in which humanity lived, in different kind of levels of consciousness and so on. But I think we'll get to that in a later session. And I wanted to step back and sort of think about why is the Hermetic worldview relevant now, and I think on a larger level we're seeing a slow but steady, but also kind of ultimately inevitable transition from reductive materialism mechanism to either something like analytic idealism or maybe panpsychism, and that is a huge game changer. I mean, basically, if you look at what quantum physics has been revealing, the 2022 prize went for these experiments that prove the universe is quote unquote not locally real. That consciousness is a major factor in what emerges and manifests. Then we also have the sort of primary data that many people are experiencing through the revival of psychedelics and the Second Reformation, in a sense. This idea of the Second Reformation is one that I really like a lot. It's from this guy, Tom Roberts, who wrote a book called The Psychedelic Future of the Mind. And Roberts argues that the first Reformation was when the Bible was translated into the common languages by Martin Luther and so on. And suddenly the people in the world could have access to the Word of God and the visions of the prophets and so on. And this led to massive social change. For instance, it led to the English Civil War, and was a major factor in a lot of people believing that the book of Revelation was being played out in their time. Now they can read it for themselves. So for Roberts, he argues that the Second Reformation is what we're in now, which is where not only can we read the Word of God and read about these visions of the prophets, we can directly have those experiences for ourselves through entheogens, through psychedelics. So I think that's super fascinating. It's a sort of democratization of the visionary experience. So I would argue, like to use a term I think that Jung liked, that we're in an enantiodromia, kind of a polarity shift, a new paradigm, and it's maybe not happening as fast as we would all like, but maybe it's only happening the only way it could happen. Because you have very entrenched institutions and elites and academies that are deeply invested in the reductive materialist paradigm. And then on the other hand, you have religious fundamentalists, fanatics, evangelicals, who have a very crude view of spirituality and the religious aspects of existence. And I'm really interested. I've been having a sort of difficult argument in the comments of my newsletter around this question of, the alchemical project and technology, which is something that Terence McKenna explored a lot. Whether our technological projections are in some sense a continuation of this sort of alchemical project, whether we are searching for the philosopher's stone in silicon and biotech and nanotech. And how does this relate to all these other very threatening things that we see happening around us, like the biospheric crisis? I mean, another reason why I feel that this Hermetic worldview is so relevant is like a lot of it is about how to summon spirits, angels, demons, how to work with other forms of consciousness or intelligence in the universe. And we seem to be engaged in a kind of occult summoning through our technology of a super intelligent being, which somebody like Steiner might have referred to as Ahriman. This is something that I think would be very interesting to explore in more depth in the course. And then, as I mentioned, in the course material, there's been a huge focus on Eastern mysticism, yoga, Tibetan Buddhism, and so on. big focus on indigenous shamanism, ayahuasca, but still it feels in the sort of new consciousness culture, there's a kind of avoidance of the Western esoteric tradition. And I think that's because of the baggage of Christianity, the negativity that sort of, intellectual people who've grown in a materialist culture. It's sort of easier for us to then adopt a philosophy that's very different than our history, really. So I mentioned analytic idealism, and the most impressive kind of person giving expression to this philosophy right now is Bernardo Kastrup, who's written all these wonderful books, including Why Materialism is Baloney. And he also has a foundation, putting out a lot of videos of his works. I really recommend getting acquainted with his ideas. I think he's really helpful. But he proposes that we're living in a mind before matter universe, that the physical world is in some sense like a dream that is a projection of this underlying field of consciousness, and sort of instinctive unitary consciousness that can only kind of encounter itself, know itself, become creative through building a world or universe in which there are kind of individuated consciousness kind of receptacles who can then have a certain level of free will and decision making. Kastrup notes that reductive materialism doesn't mesh with our most basic experience of reality or with the recent discoveries in quantum physics. And another thing, I think it's more than allegory in one of his books, but he talks about how, if the universe is indeed the projection of instinctive unitary consciousness or field of consciousness, then we fully have the right to interpret aspects of our world as the ancients did, as part of a myth or allegory or a mythological structure or dream that we're participating in. So that is very fascinating. In fact, Rudolf Steiner wrote his first book was called Philosophy of Freedom, and it was his refutation of Kantian dualism and his kind of like putting forth of a monistic idealistic perspective that was just too outside of the bounds of his time to be taken seriously in the traditional philosophy context. He sort of had to create his own movement of people already interested in occultism, mediumship, the visionary experience, and so on. And yeah, it's like seems like a lot of parallels between quantum physics and Hermeticism. And we look at the philosophy, the principle of correspondence from Hermeticism and quantum entanglement, how the basic principle of as above, so below suggests that the microcosm reflects the macrocosm and vice versa. And, we're seeing the entanglement of subatomic particles that move instantly, even across vast distances. They maintain connection. So this idea of a unitary kind of dimension of oneness, is also being revealed by quantum physics. In Hermeticism, it is believed that the mind and consciousness play a central role in shaping reality. And it's like the capacity of the magician's will and intellect, using language, number, ritual, can kind of work through the celestial and astral and natural forces to bring about transformation. And similarly, quantum physics is showing us that the act of observation affects the outcome of experiments at the quantum level. The holographic principle, which resonates with the Hermetic concept that the material world is a reflection of higher spiritual planes. It's possible our three-dimensional universe is a projection of some higher dimensional reality. And then non-locality, which challenges the classical concept of causality and supports the Hermetic thesis that we actually live in a deeply interconnected reality. Just to go a little bit deeper into the holographic universe idea, I'm sure many people are familiar with it, with David Bohm and Michael Talbot's fascinating book, The Holographic Universe. Bohm was a major quantum physicist, and he became convinced that the universe actually was functioning as a gigantic hologram. Bohm wrote, we've seen that in the quantum context, the order of every immediately perceptible aspect of the world is to be regarded as coming out of a more comprehensive implicate order, in which all aspects ultimately merge in the undefinable, immeasurable, hollow movement. Yeah, there's an implicate and an explicate order, and a kind of unfolding from the implicate order. And then I think it's interesting to think about, and I think we'll probably keep coming back to this over the course, kind of how Eastern mysticism and Western Hermeticism or Esotericism are different. I mean, they're not completely different, but they really do have very different emphases. I think one of the main differences is in the Western tradition, we are more focused on this idea of an evolutionary cosmos, a cosmos that's undergoing change and transformation. And the Eastern view is more of a static cosmos. Like the Bardo states, like this sort of endless wheel that's turning. People like Steiner and other people in these traditions, Theosophy and so on, envision a universe that's transitioning from kind of one state of being to another state of being, that humanity is evolving new capacities, that ultimately we may live in very different ways with different sensory organs, maybe not as physical. Steiner talks about the development of the spirit self as kind of a new body that humanity was developing right now. So similarly, there's a different emphasis in Buddhism. There's the idea of nirvana. So there's a kind of annihilation of the individual self as completely illusory. And in the Western Hermetic tradition, it's a little bit more of an exaltation of the individual self. I mean, there's still the absolute, the Godhead, but the individual has the capacity, through the Hermetic work, to kind of rise up to that level of the Godhead. We'll look at ancient wisdom, religion, occultism, and magic. I think a lot of particularly that sort of weird, like 19th, early 20th century kind of Eliphas Levi, like Crowley kind of vibe. It feels very like Babylonian or Chaldean or something. Like they were beaming into a lot of the sort of origin of Western ritual magic. Seems like it comes from that kind of like Near East region, the contemporary Iraq. Chaldean magic was the precursor of European medieval magic. The ceremonial magic is practiced in the Middle Ages, owed much to that of Babylon. There's a similarity between the systems shown by the introduction to medieval magic and the names of Babylonian and Assyrian gods and magicians, Beelzebub, Ishtar, Baal, Moloch. And then there are all these different strains of magic that were practiced in ancient Iraq, in Babylon, and then were kind of like revived and explored again in the early Renaissance. Demonic magic, astral magic, natural magic, talismanic magic, words of power, and so on. And I like this quote from 1917 from a scholar in Lewis Spence. There appears a deeper gloom, a more ominous spirit of the ancient and the obscure, and the magic of old Mesopotamia than that of any other land. Its mighty sanctuaries and sky-aspiring towers seem founded upon this belief in the efficacy of the spoken spell, the reiterated invocation. Thousands of spirits, various and grotesque, the parents of the ghosts and goblins of a latter day, haunt the purlieus of the temple. Demons with claw and talon, vampires, ghouls, all are there, spirits, blessed and unblessed, jinn, witch hags, lemurs, sorrowing, unburied ghosts. So there's this sort of strange kind of, I don't know, almost like slightly primitive or like barbaric quality to this sort of Babylonian magic, which I think you definitely still feel, in Crowley and so on. Egyptian Book of the Dead. Probably many people here know about that. Focus on the afterlife journey. So a lot of Egyptian practice was focused on the death and the afterlife. To ensure a successful journey for the dead to the very stage of the afterlife. The deceased heart would be weighed against the feather of Mot, the goddess of truth and justice. So I believe it was Thoth's wife. And if there was a successful judgment, if the heart is found to be lighter than the feather, the deceased is allowed to move on to the afterlife. Failed judgment, if the heart is heavier than the feather, it will be devoured by Amet, a demon with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, resulting in the second death and oblivion. So if you're facing oblivion, and it's quite interesting actually to think about all the different kind of afterlife ideas. And we'll get into that more, but particularly if we take sort of the quantum reality into account and morphogenetic fields and so on, like are these cultures, by creating these kind of like egregores of gods and afterlives, are they somehow causing effects that go beyond personal death? Does the human consciousness in a focused collective shape what gets experienced after death, and whether it's whether there's some form of metempsychosis or reincarnation, or whether it's some form of oblivion or like Hades. I think it's an interesting thing to consider. Personally, I'm quite a big believer in reincarnation. I think there's a lot of good evidence for it. I recommend the work of Ian Stevenson, who's a professor at the University of Virginia. He wrote a number of books on the topic. He wrote a 2,500-page book called Where Biology and Reincarnation Intersect. And he found children all around the world who had spontaneous recall of their past lives. And often he would bring the children to the families that they remembered being from. There'd be a sense of a kind of reunion or reconciliation. Sometimes the children would have birthmarks, like significant birthmarks, let's say on their neck. And it would turn out that they had the last life had ended with a blow to that spot or an accident. And sometimes they would look at the autopsies or photos or dig up the bodies and really be able to verify these connections. So it's pretty extraordinary evidence for reincarnation. And that's something we'll talk about more throughout the course. But Rudolf Steiner, who lived from 1865 to I think 1925, he said that the one of the principal reasons for his reincarnation at that point in human history was to actually bring the knowledge of reincarnation back to the West, that it had been lost with Judeo-Christian traditions, Christianity particularly, and that the West needed to kind of restore that knowledge and understanding. King Solomon from 10th century BC, considered like a great astral magician who was able to bind demons and get them to work for him. Built the first temple in Jerusalem. There are a number of grimoires, books of magic, and also kind of books with all these sort of different demons you can conjure that have been attributed to him, the Key of Solomon and Lesser Key of Solomon among them, but they're most likely from the Middle Ages, from like the 14th century. Solomon allegedly possessed a magic ring called the Seal of Solomon, which gave him power over the spirits. I guess he was incorporated into the Islamic tradition as Suleiman, and also seen as a very important figure in Islamic understanding. But once again, you sense that kind of like Babylonian kind of like influence. And then in the classical world, we had Eleusis, which lasted, I thought it was actually longer than 1,000 years. I thought it was more like 2,000, but at least from 600 BC to 400 AD. And the sort of elite of the Hellenic world would gather in Eleusis and undergo annual initiatory ritual involving Demeter, Persephone, Hades. Potentially, they all drank a potion called the Kykion, which may have been an entheogen. And they were really sworn to secrecy at the point of death. But yeah, these kind of, not only do they bind the classical world together for 1,000 years, they also were very important for Platonic thinking, Plato's philosophy, Neoplatonism. Cicero wrote, as the rites are called initiation, so in very truth we've learned from them the beginnings of life and gained the power not only to live happily, but also to die with a better hope. Pythagoras, I'd sort of heard about him as being like sort of a shaman archetype, kind of like a worker of miracles. He could bilocate. He could hear the music of the spheres. He had the gift of prophecy. He could sometimes control the weather or other natural forces. And obviously, he created the Pythagorean theorems in mathematics, contributed to philosophy. He discovered the mathematical relationship between musical intervals. And he also believed in some form of reincarnation or transmigration of souls. He believed the soul was immortal, and that after death it moves to a new body. He had a school, initiatory school with a lot of followers. He became kind of a political force, and ultimately one of his students, who he'd finally, I guess, banished from the school, reached a position of political power and attacked and burned down the school and killed him. And, but yeah, he was a very important figure for the Neoplatonists, and there you have it. His pupils were vegetarian, lived communally, and they observed a code of silence called Eshimithia. And then Plato, I guess his most kind of magical or sort of esoteric text is Timaeus, which is pretty hard to grasp, in that it sort of feels very like all over the place. And it's almost like, you can sense that scholars are almost like embarrassed about it. But I guess if you sort of reduce some of the cosmology in there, Plato has this idea of the demiurge. For him, that's a positive being who created sort of the divine craftsman who used eternal forms, mathematics, geometry as a blueprint to fashion the world based in order and harmony. Plato talked about the four elements as the building blocks of the cosmos. He talked about the world soul, an immaterial and divine substance that permeates the cosmos, providing it with life, intelligence, and harmony. He discussed the formation of celestial bodies, such as the stars, planets, and the earth, as part of the ordered structure of the universe. The demiurge creates the immortals, the gods, who in turn create mortal creatures, such as humans. Timaeus, also, there was a theory of metempsychosis or reincarnation. Human souls are reborn into different bodies after death, depending on their actions during their previous lives. And Plato also introduces Atlantis as a powerful advanced civilization that fell out of favor with the gods and was destroyed. So, yeah, I mean, what you find in Plato are all these like crazy kind of ideas, which in some ways remind me of some of Rudolf Steiner's kind of thinking by analogy or something. Like apparently at one point he talks about how the race of birds was created out of innocent, light-minded men who thought to pursue the study of the heavens by sight. These were transformed into birds and grew feathers instead of hair. I mean, it's like a beautiful, like, almost like childlike, like naive conception of how things occurred. One of the scholars writing on Timaeus notes, the great source of error and also the meaning of truth to the Socratics was reasoning from analogy. They could see resemblances, but not differences. They were incapable of distinguishing illustration from argument. Analogy in modern times only points the way and is immediately verified by experiment. The dreams and visions which pass through the philosopher's mind of resemblances between different classes of substances, between the animal and vegetable world, are put into the refiner's fire, and the dross and other elements which adhere to them are purged away. The contemporary of Plato and Socrates was incapable of resisting the power of any analogy which occurred to them and was drawn into any consequences which seemed to follow, such as the idea that birds were created from the innocent, light-minded men whose philosophy led them to just become birds and grow feathers instead of hair. I do love it, though. Okay, so Atlantis, I'm sort of just bookmarking this here. I'm glad that David brought it up. We'll come back to it later. In Critias, Plato also talks about Atlantis. But at a later time, there occurred portentous earthquakes and floods, and one grievous day and night befell them when the whole body of your warriors was swallowed up by the earth. The island of Atlantis in like manner was swallowed by the sea and vanished. I mean, a lively subject of discussion would be Graham Hancock's recent series, Ancient Apocalypse, which I have to admit I was very, very disappointed by. And I've known Graham for a long time and like him very much personally. But I ended up feeling that whether consciously or not, it was kind of like a grift. Like the evidence for what he was proposing was so thin, and the way he portrayed himself as a sort of victimized agent of truth, and kind of put down the archaeologists who would love to make these kind of like fantastic discoveries. I don't know, it just felt very disingenuous to me, and I was very, very sad by it. Because I did find some of Graham's work, like The Sign and the Seal about the Ark of the Covenant, I believe was his first book. I think it's quite fascinating. And I also did use Fingerprints of the Gods, was fascinating to me when I was writing the 2012 book, as he argued that many ancient cultures foresaw this cataclysmic, catastrophic event happening at or around 2012. And, in some ways, that is possible. We certainly, in terms of what's happening ecologically, we do seem to be unleashing, we don't need like an asteroid or anything. We're unleashing our own catastrophe. And I think it is possible that a lot of these ancient civilizations did have some kind of prophetic foreknowledge around this, which we can also talk about later. So the Chaldean Oracles around the 1st century AD. So this was in the Babylon, Persian Gulf region. The Chaldean Oracles were called the Bible of the Neoplatonists. They just survive in fragments. They brought together Hellenistic, Gnostic, Babylonian, and Semitic ideas, and they were given in trance to sage Julian the Theurgist. Theurgy was a set of practices for contacting the gods, sometimes being possessed by the gods, going to trance states. I just looked a little bit at the Chaldean Oracles. I would love to actually, that's one of the many pieces of the puzzle that I'd like to go back and spend more time with. It's just, I find something very beautiful about these ancient texts, actually. These are just a few quotes from it. For the first transcendent fire does not enclose its own power and matter by means of works, but by intellect. For intellect derived from intellect is the craftsman of the fiery cosmos. For the Father perfected all things and handed them over to the second intellect, which you, the entire human race, call the first intellect. So yeah, this idea of like the divine mind, the nous in Greek, is a core concept you find in this early classical thought, mystical, religious, theurgic, and magical approaches to reality. Obviously, then you have the Corpus Hermeticum, that are thought to be from the 1st and 2nd century AD, but were attributed to the ancient Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus, who was said to live in the time of Moses. But they've never found any basis for that. It's quite possible they were written in the 1st and 2nd century AD. There was a kind of a tendency back for many, many centuries where it wasn't exactly forgery, but it was more like kind of people sort of getting into the states of these like ancient, figures, or that they sort of envisioned or imagined, and then maybe actually really believing that what they were putting out was, the original source text from these ancient beings. We see that in like the Zohar, also in Jewish mysticism and so on. The philosophical focus of the Corpus Hermeticum is on the relationship between the divine and the human, and the spiritual transformation of the individual. It emphasizes the importance of attaining gnosis or divine knowledge to achieve unity with the divine. And yeah, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but so essentially, like a lot of these classical texts, I guess when you had the Dark Ages, a lot of the knowledge vanished from Italy, from Rome, and from Europe. But luckily, the Arab scholars picked it up, and there was like the library in Alexandria and so on. So a lot of the esoteric knowledge ended up in the Arab world. And then when the Constantinople was sacked in like the 10th century, and the Arab world began to break apart, scholars would sort of take these manuscripts and bring them back west to Europe, to Rome, and so on, and to Greece. And the Medici would buy the manuscripts, and then he had Marcello Ficino translate them. So Ficino translated the Corpus Hermeticum. And that was really a big inspiration for the Hermetic Kabbalistic movement in the early Renaissance. So just again, this idea of the nous, the divine mind. According to Hermetic doctrine, the universe was created by a supreme being called the One or the All, the source of wisdom, power, and existence. Nous is an aspect or emanation of the One, representing divine intellect and creative power. Human beings are thought to possess a divine spark within them, which is their own inner nous. So we have a tiny spark of this divine nous that we can spark up in a way. And by attuning ourselves to this divine intellect, Hermetic practitioners believe they can gain access to divine wisdom, achieve spiritual enlightenment, and ultimately transcend the material world. This quote is my favorite quote from the Corpus Hermeticum. It's from the dialogue with Primordial, who I guess is sort of this divine intellect speaking to a human. And he says, then if you do not make yourself equal to God, you cannot apprehend God, for like is known by like. Leap clear of all that is corporeal, and make yourself grow to a like expanse with that greatness which is beyond all measure. Rise above all time and become eternal, then you will apprehend God. Think that for you too nothing is impossible. Deem that you too are immortal, that you are able to grasp all things in your thought, to know every craft and science. Find your home in the haunts of every living creature, make yourself higher than all heights and lower than all depths. Bring together in yourself all opposites of quality, heat and cold, dryness and fluidity. Think that you are everywhere at once, on land, at sea, in heaven. Think that you are not yet begotten, that you are in the womb, that you are young, that you are old, that you have died, that you are in the world beyond the grave. Grasp in your thought all of this at once, all times and places, all substances and qualities and magnitudes together, then you can apprehend God. So the idea is that, knowing God, attaining, spiritual realization is it involves the whole being, the soul, but certainly it also involves the nous, the intellect, making this huge leap of identifying with the all in a way. So then you have this strange composite figure of Hermes Trismegistus, who brings together Thoth from Egypt and Hermes from Greece. Messenger, god of magic, themes, language, alchemy. Thoth was the Egyptian god of philosophy, language, magic, who with his wife Mat judged the dead on the moon, putting the hearts on the feather, measuring them against the feather. Antoine Fave says, according to the Arab tradition, his life is simultaneously physical and trans-temporal, after the example of Elijah's, and even in his body, he manifests a state of eternity. So I'm fascinated by this. I feel this is very much like core to the sort of kind of mythological worldview, as opposed to our kind of mechanistic worldview, that things can be both physical and trans-temporal, that the myths are events that never were and always are in a way that they're more real. They're like the structuring archetypal elements, like underlying real events or what we experience as events. I really recommend Patrick Harper's work on this topic, particularly The Philosopher's Secret Fire, which is one of my favorite books, and we'll probably talk about it again later. So in this dialogue I've been having on my comments, this French philosopher wrote about on a deadly desire for immortality concerning transhumanism, and he noted that there seems to be this relationship between the Hermetic tradition and the Renaissance, alchemy, and this sort of transhumanist quest for immortality. I think there's something to this, and at this point I don't quite know what to think about it. I know for many people, this idea, Ray Kurzweil, who's a director at Google, and wrote The Singularity is Near, is now saying that we're about 7 years away from quote unquote biological physical immortality, that our capacity to extend the lifespan is going to be accelerating to the point where every year of life that you have, you'll have more than a year's worth of treatments that will allow you to continue indefinitely. So it's essentially indefinite life, because your biological existence can still be terminated, obviously by a bomb or falling out of a window or accident or whatever. So this comment, Jean-Michel Besnier says, we may strive to register transhumanism in a vein of inspiration going back to the Hermetic philosophy of Hermes Trismegistus. This mythical character of ancient Greco-Egyptian antiquity, an amalgam of Hermes and Thoth, combined knowledge and technology in the same religion. Honed the alchemic instinct of the of science and justified the quest for immortality that was nourished by it. This religion, born of Hermeticism, then encountered Christian Gnosticism and the belief that if the world might be corrupt, knowledge can play a redemptive role. It is said that this religion encouraged, above all, a magical mentality, which we are not completely without even now, a mentality which leads us to entrust the key to the ultimate explanation of things to some kind of code, a numerical code for the disciples of Pythagoras, an alphabetical code for the Kabbalists, an informational code for contemporaries of universal digitization, etc. Last but not least, Hermetic philosophy awakens the religion that encourages the making of gods by essentially according immortality to humans themselves. So yeah, I guess I'm just, rating this as something to explore in the course and problematize. I mean, it's just very, very interesting to me. And obviously, McKenna Terence was very interesting on this topic too. He saw very much the melding of alchemy and Silicon Valley and the technological quest for the ultimate artifact and so on. The Emerald Tablet, also I think from maybe 1st century AD. I won't read the whole thing, but yeah, essentially, as above, so below, and this sort of like a bit of an alchemical formula for discovering this, philosopher's stone, which is, it's very interesting. This sort of endlessly complex, elaborate alchemical search for some physical correlate of this spiritual vision that many of the greatest minds for many centuries were obsessed with this quest. And it's very fascinating. Where did that archetype come from? And because it doesn't seem as if the philosopher's stone, in its traditional imagination, was ever achieved. So just other currents of ancient wisdom. You have the Kabbalistic current, the Sefer Yetzirah, which talks about God creating the world using these 32 paths of wisdom, the 10 Sephirot, the 22 elemental letters of the Hebrew alphabet, which form the foundation of creation. From the first 4 Sephirot, and the spirit, Ruach, the living God, the 3 primal elements of air, water, and fire. And the element of air, God engraved the 22 letters. The Sefer Yetzirah outlines the process of creation, the manipulation of the Hebrew alphabet and the 10 Sephirot, the divine attributes or emanations through which God interacts with the world. So this will become extremely important to Hermetic alchemists and magi, like John Dee, and Cornelius Agrippa, who will sort of see. Agrippa really thought that the Hebrew alphabet, that these were like letters really formed closer to the beginning of creation and had the power to transmute reality in a deeper way. All right, I guess we'll stop there. Feel free to write me comments. Please use the discussion board, get to know each other. And yeah, I'm super open if you all have ideas of things that should be covered, within the parameters of the structure. And it was really great to share this with you, and really appreciate the enthusiasm. And good to see you too, Esty. You just popped up. Yeah. All right, thank you, everybody.